In April 2025, the United States government spent $30 million on a piece of software.
Right. Which honestly sounds like a rounding error for the federal government.
Exactly. Yeah. It sounds like nothing. But the thing is, it wasn't for, advanced avionics.
Right.
It wasn't for submarine navigation or anything like that. It was a contract specifically for immigration and customs enforcement, ICE.
Yeah, to build an artificial intelligence platform.
Yes, called Immigration OS. And the stated goal of this thing, to track, predict, and automate the deportation of human beings at an absolute massive scale.
Which is, it's heavy stuff right out of the gate.
It really is. And, if you're just a normal citizen listening to this, you probably didn't hear a single thing about this contract.
No, of course not. It was totally buried in, obscure procurement databases.
Right. But the company that won that contract, they didn't just build a tool. They built what they genuinely view as, well, a blueprint for the future of the American state.
And today, we're taking a deep dive into the architects of that very blueprint.
Exactly. But before we jump in, we need to be very clear about what we were looking at today.
Yes, definitely. Because we are so accustomed to thinking of software as this, this passive inert utility, right?
Yeah, like Microsoft Word doesn't care what you type into it.
Exactly. Excel doesn't care about your political ideology.
Right.
But what happens when the software that runs your taxes or, targets military drone strikes and tracks local crime, what if that is fundamentally designed to execute a specific, highly controversial political philosophy?
Yeah. What happens when the code itself has an agenda?
That's the core question.
And that is the exact premise of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a genuinely explosive investigation published on April 20th, 2026.
Right, by the writer Dean Blundell.
Yes, Dean Blundell. And the piece is titled, get ready for this, Peter Thiel's Palantir, the company that owns the Trump regime, just published their 22-point manifesto for America. And it's terrifying.
The heck of a title.
It really is. And obviously the target of this investigation is Palantir, right? The $400 billion data analytics giant.
Yeah, and specifically this manifesto they recently released that just sort of, lays bare their entire worldview.
Now, before we get into the weeds here, I need to make something crystal clear to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The source material we are working from today, it dives headfirst into incredibly polarizing, highly volatile U.S. politics.
Oh, absolutely.
It touches heavily on the Trump administration, ICE, the IRS, and some deeply, deeply controversial political theories.
It really runs the gamut.
So our mission today is to act entirely as impartial analysts. We are sitting in strictly neutral territory.
Right. No sides being taken here.
Exactly. We are not taking political sides, and we are definitely not endorsing these viewpoints. Our job is just to rigorously report on the arguments, the timelines, and the historical parallels laid out in this investigation.
Right. And to just ask one question, really. If these claims hold true, how does the actual machinery of this power work?
Exactly.
Because it's an essential boundary to set, I think. We are dissecting the architecture of a machine.
Right.
So whether you identify with the political left, the right, or, you reject the whole spectrum entirely, understanding the mechanics of how raw data, venture capital, and state violence merge, it's simply a requirement for navigating the modern world.
It really is. We are focusing on the how and the why. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The investigation demands that before we even look at this 22-point manifesto, we have to completely reframe our understanding of what Palantir actually is.
Yeah, the text argues we need to stop comparing them to, ExxonMobil or Lockheed Martin or Facebook.
Because they are operating in a totally unprecedented category.
And what's really fascinating here is the structural breakdown of this new category. Blundell argues that Palantir is the first private corporation in modern history to successfully fuse 4 distinct pillars of power.
4 pillars, or as he calls them, the 4 cards.
Right, the 4 cards. And if you look at the mechanics of statecraft over, say, the last 5 centuries, civilizations have gone to enormous, painstaking lengths to keep these specific cards separated.
Yeah, you keep the military apparatus in one box, the domestic surveillance machine in another.
Exactly. And the ideological steering committee and the raw financial capital all in different silos.
Because that friction, that separation, that is essentially the textbook definition of checks and balances, right?
Exactly. And the investigation's core claim is that Palantir holds all 4 cards in a single hand.
So let's look at the mechanics of that first card. State surveillance.
This is where it gets really wild.
Yeah, the historical parallel drawn here is just staggering. The text brings up the Stasi.
Right, the secret police of East Germany during the Cold War.
Exactly. Which is, widely considered the gold standard of an oppressive surveillance state.
Oh, without doubt.
But when you actually look at the logistics of how the Stasi operated, it was incredibly burdensome, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly burdensome. I mean, the logistical overhead was just astronomical.
Right.
To maintain that level of control over a population of roughly 17 million people, the East Germans required roughly 91,000 official officers.
Wow.
And get this, an estimated 189,000 civilian informants.
So, wait, hold on. We are talking about nearly 300,000 people to watch 17 million.
Basically, yeah.
That's almost one watcher for every 50 citizens.
Precisely. And think about the physical infrastructure, too.
Yeah.
They had literal warehouses full of physical paper files.
Right, just boxes and boxes.
Yeah. They had people sitting in unventilated rooms, steaming open envelopes over kettles. They had switchboard operators physically listening to tapped phone lines and, transcribing them on typewriters.
Wow.
It was a very physical, very labor-intensive, geographically constrained machine. It was friction-heavy.
Which brings us to the contrast with Palantir. Because the text argues that their core software platforms, Foundry and Gotham, accomplish the exact same surveillance saturation, but for 330 million Americans.
Right, the entire country.
And they do it using just, quote, a server rack and a login.
It's chilling.
But I want to push back on this a bit, or at least drill down, because how does that actually work? It's easy to just say, oh, they track everything, but what is the actual mechanism?
Well, the mechanism is what they call ontology mapping.
Okay, ontology mapping.
Yeah. Before Palantir, government databases were heavily siloed. The DMV had your license plate.
Right.
The IRS had your income. A local hospital had your medical records. ICE had border crossing data. And none of these systems talked to each other because they were built on totally different architectures.
It's just a bureaucratic mess.
Exactly. What Palantir software does is it sits on top of all these disparate databases and creates a unified ontology, a way of linking the data points.
Okay, so it connects the dots.
Right. It realizes that a license plate scanned at a toll booth in Texas is connected to a specific tax ID in Florida, which is then connected to a specific prescription filled in Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it doesn't just store the data. It maps all the relationships in real time.
So it's basically omniscience without the overhead. You don't need 300,000 informants if the software acts as a universal translator for every digital footprint a citizen leaves.
Exactly.
And that leads to the second card, which shifts this from, passive observation to active enforcement, military targeting.
Right.
Palantir isn't just organizing filing cabinets for bureaucrats here. They are acting as the targeting engine for the military.
And this is a critical evolution. The investigation details how the Israel Defense Forces actively use Palantir systems to process battlefield data and select targets in Gaza.
Wow.
And how the U.S. Army recently awarded the company a $10 billion contract. The crucial phrase used in the text is that Palantir has evolved from a contractor to the decision layer.
Let me stop you there, because the military has an incredibly bloated bureaucratic procurement process. They don't just hand the keys over.
No, they don't.
What does it actually mean to be the decision layer in a military context?
Well, think about the Cold War paradigm of a defense contractor. A company like Boeing or Lockheed Martin engineered a physical asset, right?
Like a jet.
Yeah, they built a fighter jet, they delivered it to the Pentagon, they handed over the keys, and they stepped back.
Right. Their job is done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The military made all the decisions about how, when, and where to use it. But Palantir operates fundamentally differently.
Okay.
Their artificial intelligence is ingesting live drone feeds, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and logistics data, and the software is actively shortlisting targets.
Wait, really? The software is picking the targets?
Yes, it is analyzing the probabilities and suggesting who or what should be struck.
So if a missile hits a building, the physical missile might have been built by Lockheed, but the intelligence that decided that specific building was a viable target at that specific time that was generated by Palantir's algorithm.
Exactly.
They aren't just forging the sword, they are guiding the hand that swings it.
Exactly. And that brings us to the friction point of the third card, the ideology. Because if the software is making decisions, you have to ask who writes the rules for the software.
Who programs the bias, basically.
Right. And the text argues that Palantir possesses the ideological project of a specific faction that openly wants democracy to end.
Which is a massive claim.
It is. The claim is explicit. This isn't a company whose executives just happen to hold unsavory political opinions. The text argues that the bad politics are the product roadmap.
Wow. The bad politics are the product roadmap.
Yeah. The software is inherently designed to facilitate an anti-democratic worldview.
And before we get into the specifics of that ideology, we have to mention the fourth card, the capital.
Right, the funding.
How is this machine funded? The text points to the company's absorption of highly controversial, deeply compromised funding, specifically citing enormous investments from Jeffrey Epstein.
Which we will get into.
Yeah, we are going to dedicate a massive segment to that financial shadow shortly. But the overarching point here is that this company metabolized a level of reputational scandal that would have instantly vaporized any normal corporation.
Oh, completely.
And they did it while expanding their grip on highly classified federal power.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the investigation leans on a very chilling historical parallel to illustrate why holding all four of these cards, surveillance, military targeting, ideology, and compromised capital, is so completely unprecedented.
Oh, the IBM parallel. I was really hoping we'd talk about this.
Yeah, it's vital.
The IBM parallel is incredibly dark, but it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of state corporate complicity.
It is vital for understanding the warning being issued here. So, in the 1930s, IBM, operating through its German subsidiary Die Homag, leased Hollerith punch card machines to the Third Reich.
Okay.
Now, we need to understand the technology. These Hollerith machines were the absolute pinnacle of data processing at the time. You fed a physical card into the machine, and based on where holes were punched, it could instantly categorize massive amounts of demographic data.
So instead of a human clerk sorting thousands of files by hand, the machine could automatically filter out citizens by religion, by profession, by geographic location.
Precisely. They allowed the Reich to conduct censuses and index citizens, identifying Jewish people, Roma, and other targeted groups with a terrifying mechanical efficiency.
Wow.
IBM provided the filing system that made the logistics of the Holocaust possible. But, and this is the absolute core of the argument being made by Glendale, IBM only held one card.
Right.
They held the information processing card. IBM did not hold the military power. They didn't have a private army. And importantly, IBM did not invent the fascist ideology.
Right, they were just businessmen.
Exactly. They were purely opportunistic capitalists renting out hardware. The ideology and the military violence belonged entirely to the state.
But with Palantir, the text argues, the dynamic is completely inverted.
Right.
They hone on information processing, they're deeply embedded in the military targeting, and as the investigation claims, they are the ones driving the ideology.
Yes. But I know what you're thinking. Let's address the obvious counterargument here.
Right, let me play the skeptic for a second, because I can hear you, the listener, shouting this at your speakers right now.
Sure.
Aren't all big tech companies doing this? I mean, doesn't Google read every email I send to serve me targeted ads? Doesn't Meta track my geolocation and web history to build a psychological profile of me?
Oh, absolutely.
They are all collecting massive, incomprehensible amounts of data. So why is Palantir uniquely dangerous?
It is the most common defense, and it's one the text directly anticipates. The distinction lies entirely in the application of that data and the proximity to state violence.
Okay, unpack that.
Meta wants to map your psychological profile so they can convince you to buy, like, a specific brand of sneakers, right?
Right.
Palantir wants to map your data to power the state's enforcement mechanisms, to decide if you should be audited, deported, or targeted.
Let's use an analogy to clarify this, because the mechanism is really what matters here. Imagine Google and Meta own the world's largest library. They have all the books, all the magazines, all the data on human behavior. And a company like Lockheed Martin, they are the engineers locked in a basement building a highly advanced missile.
Right.
Google has the data, Lockheed has the weapon. What the investigation is arguing is that Palantir isn't just the librarian categorizing the books.
No.
Palantir is a librarian who has their finger resting gently on the launch button of the missile.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. They have the data, but they also have the authority, the API integration, and the government contracts to act on that data with lethal or legal force. Google doesn't build targeting systems, and Lockheed doesn't harvest your search history. But Palantir does both.
That synthesis is the exact friction point, which
Right.
naturally demands that we examine the ideology itself.
Right.
Because if Palantir's software acts as a universal adapter for all these messy, disconnected government databases, who gets to decide the categories?
Yeah, who writes the rules for the algorithm?
Exactly. If the software is the engine, we have to look at the minds that drafted the blueprint.
Exactly. If that is the machine, who are the architects?
Right.
The investigation spends a significant portion of its text unpacking the ideological engine driving the company, focusing heavily on two figures, Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin.
Yes.
Let's start with Peter Thiel. He is Palantir's co-founder, its chairman, its largest shareholder, and according to the text, its, quote, ideological spine.
To understand Thiel's framework, the investigation points back to a highly specific essay he wrote in 2009 for the Cato Institute.
Okay.
Now, we have to contextualize 2009. We are in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis.
Right.
And we are at the dawn of the massive smartphone and social media tech boom. There was this intense feeling among Silicon Valley elites that traditional government was failing, but technology could solve everything.
Classic tech hubris.
Oh, totally. And in this essay, Thiel explicitly stated that he no longer believed that freedom and democracy were compatible.
Wow. That is not a subtle statement.
No, it is a foundational rejection of the American experiment. And the text also notes that, going back as far as 2004, Thiel has expressed deep frustration with the U.S. Constitution.
Really?
Yeah, suggesting that its checks and balances actively prevent any single ambitious visionary from reconstructing the republic.
And the investigation makes a point to emphasize that Thiel isn't hiding these views in, like, private diaries. He is publishing them. He is bragging about them.
Yes.
And crucially, the text connects this 2009 philosophy directly to modern hard political power.
This is where it gets real.
Right. The investigation details how Thiel acted as a massive financial patron for J.D. Vance, who, in the timeline of this April 2026 article, is the Vice President of the United States.
Right.
Thiel dropped roughly $15 million into Vance's 2022 Senate primary alone. The author draws a straight, unbroken line from that 2009 essay rejecting democracy, straight to the blank checkbook and right into the second highest office in the land.
And this introduces a critical historical concept, the frustrated capital class.
The frustrated capital class, what does that mean?
Well, if you look at authoritarian turns throughout history, they rarely start as grassroots peasant uprisings. They very often feature incredibly wealthy industrialists who decide that democratic processes, debates, voting, committee hearings, are simply too slow.
Oh, I see.
They're too messy or too inefficient to get things done. They view the checks and balances of a parliament or a Congress not as protections for the minority, but as obstacles to production.
Right. It's an efficiency thing for them.
Exactly. The investigation is suggesting Thiel operates directly from this historical playbook. The core belief that a republic needs to be bypassed or dismantled purely for the sake of efficiency.
And if Thiel is the billionaire financier of this worldview, Curtis Yarvin is the philosopher providing the intellectual scaffolding.
Yes.
The text refers to Yarvin as Palantir's house monarchist.
Yarvin is a fascinating and disturbing figure. He is a central architect of a political movement known as the Dark Enlightenment, or Neo-Reaction. Now, Yarvin's philosophy is usually buried across incredibly dense 10,000-word blog posts filled with esoteric historical references.
Right, very inaccessible.
Very.
Yeah.
But the investigation distills his program down to a very blunt, actionable set of goals. Abolish democracy entirely, install a CEO king who has absolute dictatorial control, run America literally like a joint stock corporation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and let the so-called real people, meaning the tech elite and the wealthy, run the world without the interference of voters.
So it's essentially feudalism, but managed by venture capitalists.
Exactly.
And the text is quick to point out the financial ties here as well. This isn't just, an intellectual affinity. Thiel invested $100,000 into Yarvin's startup in 2013.
Right.
Yarvin has publicly claimed that he was coaching Thiel politically, describing him as fully enlightened to these anti-democratic ideas.
It's a very tight circle.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit surreal. The investigation points out the company's name itself, Palantir.
Oh, this is so good.
Right. If you are a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, you know exactly what a Palantir is.
Yep.
They are the seeing stones. They are ancient magical artifacts that allow the user to see anything, anywhere, across vast distances of space and time.
Right.
Now, on a surface level, it sounds like a very clever, slightly nerdy name for a data surveillance company.
It does, until you examine the actual narrative arc of those stones in the literature.
Exactly. The text points out the brutal, almost comedic irony of this. In Tolkien's books, every single Palantir that survives into the Third Age gets corrupted by the Dark Lord Sauron.
Right.
Every single character who attempts to use a seeing stone is either driven completely insane or entirely corrupted by it.
Every single one.
Saruman looks into the stone, believes he can control the data he is seeing, and ends up betraying the forces of good. Denethor looks into the stone, goes mad with despair from the sheer volume of negative information he's fed, and literally sets himself on fire.
It is a profound literary oversight on their part. Or, as the investigation suggests, perhaps it is a subconscious submission.
Right. The text marvels at the sheer audacity or the total blindness of naming your omniscient global surveillance company after a cursed object that universally destroys the minds of the people who try to use it for control.
It's wild.
The author writes, they named the company after cursed objects, and then they acted surprised when the curse took.
The literary symbolism is incredibly potent, but the investigation moves from fictional parallels to very real historical ones.
Right.
To explain Curtis Yarvin's specific role in this ecosystem, the text references a highly unsettling comparison drawn by an essay in Time magazine, comparing Yarvin to Filippo Marinetti.
Okay, stop there and explain Marinetti to me, because when I read that part of the text, it felt like a very specific, very chilling comparison, but I didn't fully grasp the mechanics of it.
Sure, it requires a bit of art history.
Okay.
Filippo Marinetti was an Italian poet in the early 20th century, and he was the founder of the Futurist movement. In 1909, Marinetti wrote the Futurist Manifesto. It was a document that aggressively glorified speed, technology, industrialization, and violence.
Really? Violence?
Oh, yeah. He famously called war the world's only hygiene.
Good Lord.
He argued that museums and libraries should be burned down because they represented the stagnant past, and he declared that democracy was entirely obsolete.
So he was an extremist artist, but how does that connect to Yarvin and Palantir?
Because of what Marinetti achieved culturally, Marinetti didn't invent fascism. Benito Mussolini did.
Okay.
But what Marinetti did do, and this is the crucial parallel the investigation is drawing, is make those authoritarian, violent, anti-democratic ideas fashionable for the cultured intellectual classes of Italy.
Ah, I see.
He took ideas that would have sounded thuggish or barbaric, and he dressed them up in avant-garde poetry. He provided the aesthetic permission structure for fascism. He made it cool for the elites to hate democracy.
Ah, I see. So the text is arguing that Yarvin is essentially Marinetti in a Patagonia vest.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yarvin is taking these deeply authoritarian ideas, abolishing the republic, installing a tech CEO dictator, and he's dressing them up in complex systems theory and software metaphors.
Exactly.
He's making authoritarianism sound intellectual, edgy, and appealing to Silicon Valley billionaires who think they are smarter than everyone else.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
He provides the intellectual permission structure. And the investigation goes one step further into the historical deep end, bringing up a man named Carl Schmitt.
Or was he?
Now, Schmitt was a prominent, highly respected legal theorist in Germany who eventually joined the Nazi Party.
Okay.
His core philosophical project was proving that liberal democracy is inherently weak and incapable of handling real crises.
Right, because democracies have to debate and vote and pass laws, which takes time.
Exactly. Schmitt's most famous argument is about the state of exception.
State of exception.
Yeah. He argued that true sovereignty, true power, doesn't belong to the Constitution or the Parliament. True sovereignty belongs to whoever has the power to suspend the law during a state of emergency.
Oh, wow.
Schmitt essentially provided the complex legal justification that allowed the Weimar Republic to legally suspend its own civil liberties in 1933.
So he gave them the legal loophole.
Exactly. And the investigation argues that Yarvin is the Carl Schmitt of the American tech right.
I see.
He is providing the philosophical and structural justification for bypassing the U.S. Constitution. The text argues that we have seen this historical pattern before. We know exactly how it ends. The only difference now is that the people pushing it have infinitely better software.
It paints a picture of an ideology that doesn't just want to win the next election. It wants to fundamentally alter the architecture of the state so that elections no longer matter.
That's exactly it.
And if that is the ideological foundation, the investigation forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. Where did the capital to build this machine come from?
Right.
Because, how do you fund the early stages of an omniscient surveillance apparatus? And this leads us into the darkest financial corner of the text, the Epstein connection.
Yes. This is where the investigation shifts from philosophical and historical critique to hard, documented financial forensics.
Right.
The text relies on primary document subpoenas, bank records, and emails released by the House Oversight Committee in November 2025 and the Department of Justice in February 2026.
So very recent.
Very recent. These documents reveal a deep financial and personal relationship between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein, showing they corresponded regularly from roughly 2014 through early 2019.
We have to stop and aggressively underline that timeline, 2014 to 2019.
Yeah, the timeline is key.
Jeffrey Epstein was first convicted as a registered sex offender in Florida in 2008. The stories were public. The police reports were public.
Well, it wasn't a secret.
Not at all. So we are talking about a relationship that blossomed and flourished a full decade after Epstein was globally known and legally registered as a convicted serial child rapist.
Right.
And this correspondence continued right up until months before Epstein's final arrest and death in federal custody for international sex trafficking.
And that timeline is the absolute crux of the investigation's outrage. This cannot be brushed off as like a naive association made before Epstein's crimes were public knowledge.
Right.
The text details that Epstein invested $40 million into two funds managed by Thiel's venture capital firm, Valor Ventures, across 2015 and 2016.
$40 million.
Yes. Furthermore, that initial $40 million investment eventually grew to roughly $170 million within Thiel's financial ecosystem.
The text mentions a specific detail that highlights how intertwined they were. It quotes former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who was also entangled in this network, describing Epstein and Thiel as co-owners of the fund.
Right.
Now, to be fair to the reporting, Thiel's lawyers have vehemently disputed the term co-owner, insisting that Epstein was merely a limited partner.
Sure.
But the investigation largely dismisses this as lawyer distinctions. The core, undeniable fact remains. An enormous amount of capital generated by a convicted sex trafficker was injected into the ecosystem of the man building the U.S. government's surveillance infrastructure.
And the ties weren't just purely transactional on a spreadsheet either. The personal ties were extensively documented.
Right.
In recorded messages, Epstein referred to Thiel as his great friend. In 2015, Epstein attended a now infamous dinner in Palo Alto with Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and other members of the Silicon Valley elite.
Wow.
Epstein himself described the dinner in an email as wild.
The investigation points out the horrifying normalization of all this. Epstein, despite his horrific public convictions, was still being treated as a peer.
Right.
He was a trusted Rolodex, a strategic patron, moving freely within the absolute highest echelons of tech capital.
Yeah.
The text notes that in recorded conversations, Epstein even floated Palantir as a specific place where Ehud Barak should try to get a job, leveraging his personal connection to Thiel.
It's incredibly cozy.
Now, I have to stop here, because this is the point where the cognitive dissonance becomes entirely deafening.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Right. If a regular citizen, someone listening to this right now, wants to get a basic entry-level security clearance to work in a mailroom at the Pentagon or to do IT support for the Department of Energy, they face intense, invasive scrutiny.
Absolutely.
They have to fill out an SF-86 form. The government will check your credit score for late payments.
Yep.
They will interview your high school teachers. They will ask your neighbors if you drink too much. They will scrutinize every foreign financial transaction you've ever made.
It's exhaustive.
If you have a questionable cousin, you might get denied. So how on earth does a company whose chairman has deep, documented multi-million-dollar financial ties to an international sex trafficker maintain billions of dollars in highly classified defense contracts?
It is a profound contradiction, and it is the exact reason the investigation highlights it so heavily.
Right.
The text explicitly states that bringing up Epstein is not a media hit cheap shot. It is not tabloid gossip. The investigation frames this as a severe structural vulnerability in the capital architecture of the company. It is demanding that the public recognize the sheer insanity of the situation.
Right.
The United States government is outsourcing its most sensitive, classified data deportation tracking, tax audits, military targeting inputs to an entity whose financial roots are deeply entangled with a compromised criminal.
The text makes a terrifying point about how Palantir handled this. It says this isn't a scandal that Palantir simply survived through good PR.
Right.
It says it's a scandal they absorbed, they metabolized it, they integrated it into their history and moved past it while the regulatory agencies looked the other way.
It just became part of the cost of doing business.
Exactly. The scandal simply became part of the machinery. And if that machinery is built on the anti-democratic ideology of Curtis Yarvin and funded by the compromised capital of Jeffrey Epstein, we have to look at how deeply it is currently embedded into the actual U.S. government. Which brings us from the realm of philosophy and venture capital right into the concrete reality of federal integration.
Right. This is where the investigation transitions into a terrifying audit of federal contracts.
Okay, lay it out.
The text details a list of recent acquisitions to prove that Palantir is no longer functioning as an external vendor. They are actively becoming the internal operating system of the state.
Okay.
It starts with IC, immigration, and customs enforcement. In April 2025, Palantir secured a $30 million contract to build Immigration OS.
Let's break down what Immigration OS actually is based on the text, because it's not just a spreadsheet of names.
No, the text describes it as a comprehensive AI platform designed to track what they call self-deportations and feed algorithmic targeting directly into a mass deportation machine.
Wow.
It links housing records, utility bills, and traffic citations to identify undocumented individuals.
Yeah.
And critically, the investigation notes a deeply concerning conflict of interest.
What's that?
The political architect of that specific deportation program
Yeah.
reportedly holds a personal financial stake in Palantir.
Wow. And it doesn't stop at immigration enforcement either. The investigation moves to the IRS.
Right.
The text reports that Palantir software engineers are allegedly embedded directly inside the Internal Revenue Service, and their goal, to build a single searchable database of every single American's tax records linked to their other governmental data profiles.
Which is a massive legal red flag.
Oh, yes.
The text points out that lawmakers, specifically Senator Ron Wyden and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, flagged this exact project as flatly illegal in a June 2025 letter, citing massive privacy violations.
All right.
Yet the project moves forward. And why? The investigation points to the revolving door. It notes that several members of the government entity that officially selected Palantir for this massive IRS contract are themselves former Palantir employees.
The revolving door just keeps spinning at the highest levels. The text states that the White House recently hired Palantir's former head of intelligence to serve as the federal chief information officer.
Right.
The Pentagon handed Palantir a $10 billion Army logistics and targeting contract. The Navy awarded them a $1 billion software contract. The head of Palantir's defense business is a former congressman who is deeply tied to the current administration's military nominations.
The precise terminology the investigation uses to describe this phenomenon is vital. The text argues that this is not simply regulatory capture.
Okay, define regulatory capture for us.
Regulatory capture is a well-documented phenomenon. It's when an industry, like big tobacco or the pharmaceutical industry, uses massive lobbying funds to essentially buy off the referees.
Right, the FDA or the EPA regulators who are supposed to oversee them.
Exactly. The investigation argues that what Palantir is doing goes far beyond regulatory capture. This is when the industry becomes the field, the ball, and the stadium.
Right.
They aren't capturing the regulators. They were becoming the infrastructure itself.
Let's use a mechanism-based analogy to explain why this is so permanent. Think about how software APIs work.
Okay.
Imagine the United States government currently speaks 50 different, entirely incompatible languages. The Navy speaks French, the IRS speaks Japanese, ICE speaks German, the VA speaks Italian.
Sounds accurate.
Because of this, they can never efficiently share information. Palantir comes in and doesn't just offer to act as a temporary translator. Palantir builds a completely new proprietary synthetic language.
Right.
They force every single department to translate all their historical data into this new language, and then they copyright the dictionary.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it.
Once in the military, the tax authority and the Border Patrol are completely reliant on this proprietary language to function. What happens? If the government decides they want to fire Palantir, they can't.
No, they're stuck.
If they uninstall the software, they literally lose the ability to communicate with their own databases. They would suffer a total bureaucratic stroke.
That concept vendor lock-in at the sovereign level is exactly what the text is highlighting.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger historical picture, the investigation provides a masterful, deeply sobering parallel. It compares Palantir's current trajectory not to a tech company, but to the East India Company.
Oh, this was wild.
And the text demands that the reader really sit with the mechanics of this comparison.
I found this part incredibly illuminating. A lot of people have heard the name East India Company, maybe from high school history class or a pirate movie.
Sure.
But the actual logistical reality of what that corporation was is mind-blowing.
It truly is. From the early 1600s through 1858, the British East India Company wasn't just a business importing spices, silk, and tea.
Right.
It was a private joint stock corporation that effectively ruled the entire Indian subcontinent. We are talking about a corporation that raised its own private armies.
Wait, really? Private armies?
Yes. At its peak, the East India Company had roughly 250,000 private soldiers on its payroll, which was literally twice the size of the official British National Army.
A corporation with a private army twice the size of the state's army. That is just, I mean, it's unfathomable today.
Yes, and it operated exactly like a state. It collected land taxes from millions of Indian citizens.
Wow.
It negotiated international treaties with foreign monarchs. It minted its own currency. It literally fought massive bloody wars purely for corporate profit.
And the investigation heavily highlights the human cost of allowing a corporation to act as a sovereign state.
Yes.
The text points out a specific historical atrocity. The East India Company caused the Bengal famine of 1770, an event which starved to death an estimated 10 million human beings.
It's horrific.
And the text asks why famine happened. It wasn't just a drought. It happened because the company's revenue model, their strict requirement to show quarterly earnings growth to their shareholders in London, demanded brutal, unyielding taxation and agricultural policies. They forced farmers to grow cash crops like indigo instead of rice. They prioritized profit margins over human survival. The East India Company answered nominally to the British Crown, but practically, operationally, they answered only to their shareholders' balance sheet.
And that is the exact core of the warning being issued in the text. The British Parliament eventually had to step in and fully nationalize the East India Company in 1858, dissolving it entirely.
Right, because it went too far.
Exactly. Because it had become terrifyingly obvious that the actual sovereign power of the British Empire had been quietly outsourced to unaccountable private shareholders. The investigation is arguing that Palantir is executing the exact same playbook today.
Wow.
They were just exchanging muskets, galleons, and spice routes for artificial intelligence, server racks, and data streams.
The author writes a brilliant line. The East India Company had holorith machines. It just didn't know it yet. Palantir has them now.
That's a great line.
They are bypassing the democratic state, not by staging a violent coup, but by simply becoming the indispensable utility that the state relies upon to survive.
Which finally brings us to the inciting incident for this entire investigation. The manifesto.
Right, the 22 points.
After establishing the anti-democratic ideology, the compromised Epstein capital, and the deep, inescapable integration into the federal government, we arrive at the weekend where Palantir simply laid their cards on the table.
Yep.
They published a 22-point manifesto outlining their worldview. And the title of this document is just dripping with tech bro arrogance because we get asked a lot.
Because we get asked a lot. It's so condescending.
It really is. The investigation notes that the global reaction to this document was starkly, violently divided.
How so?
Well, on one hand, a prominent Belgian philosopher read it and immediately categorized it as techno-fascism. Various economists and political theorists viewed it as a horrifying, explicit roadmap for the death of the Western democratic empire.
Right.
Yet the text notes with bitter, exhausting irony that the mainstream American financial press largely treated it like a spicy promotional tour for a CEO's new business book.
Of course they did.
And the ultimate metric of capitalism. The stock market rewarded Palantir with a massive surge in share price upon its release.
So we really need to break down exactly what is actually written in this manifesto, because the investigation pulls out specific points and analyzes the mechanisms behind them.
Let's do it.
Let's start with point 15. The manifesto explicitly states, quote, "The post-war neutering of Germany and Japan must be undone."
Okay, the investigation asks the reader to pause and read that sentence a second time.
Right.
You have an American defense contractor holding tens of billions of dollars in highly classified Pentagon contracts, publicly arguing that the denazification of Germany and the post-war demilitarization of Imperial Japan, which are, the foundational pillars of global peace since 1945, were historical mistakes that need to be reversed.
The text points out how deeply alarming and specific this rhetoric is. That exact phrase, "the neutering of Germany must be undone," is not a new idea cooked up in Silicon Valley.
No, not at all.
The investigation notes it is the exact verbatim rhetoric that the actual literal descendants of the Nazi Party have been circulating in the European far right for decades.
Right.
It is the core language of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany political party, whose leaders have legally been classified as fascist by German intelligence courts. It is the exact language of Japanese historical revisionists who actively try to erase the Nanking massacre from history textbooks.
So the obvious question the text asks is, why?
Mm.
Why would a Silicon Valley data analytics company suddenly champion the rhetoric of European neo-fascists?
Right, what's in it for them?
And the investigation provides the grim, undeniable capitalistic logic. A rapidly remilitarized Germany and a remilitarized Japan represent massive, untapped, multi-billion-dollar markets for defense software.
Yeah, of course.
Palantir is acting as a sophisticated lobbyist for historical revisionism because, as the text bluntly puts it, the ideology is the sales funnel.
The ideology is the sales funnel.
They are selling the rehabilitation of fascist-era militarism, not necessarily because they harbor a deep love for the 1930s, but simply because it opens up massive new avenues for quarterly revenue. War is profitable, and they sell the software of war.
It's staggering. It's literally the East India Company prioritizing cash crops over food, but on a geopolitical scale.
Exactly.
Let's move to point 21 of the manifesto, which might be the most philosophically terrifying part of the entire document. The manifesto states, quote, "Some cultures have produced vital advances, others remain dysfunctional and regressive."
This is the exact sentence that made philosophers reach for the term techno-fascism.
Right.
The investigation does not mince words here. It identifies this explicitly as civilizational ranking.
Civilizational ranking.
The text compares it directly to the foundational logic of the 1935 Nuremberg laws in Germany, or the deeply racist pseudoscience promoted in the 1994 book, The Bell Curve. But the terrifying difference is that this civilizational ranking is now backed by a shiny Stanford University pedigree, slick graphic design, and massive U.S. government enforcement contracts.
And the text explicitly ties this point directly back to Curtis Yarvin and the Dark Enlightenment.
Yes.
The investigation argues that this idea that certain groups of people are inherently regressive and unfit for self-governance is exactly what Yarvin has been arguing in dark, obscure corners of the internet for 15 years. Now, that fringe ideology has been laundered into a polished corporate LinkedIn post by a publicly traded company.
And this is where the investigation connects the philosophy back to the software mechanisms we discussed earlier.
Okay, the ontology mapping.
Right. The text asks, if Palantir creates the ontology, if they build the universal translator that maps all government data, who gets to define the categories? The author writes a chilling warning. When a private company with access to every American's tax records, immigration status, license plate movements, medical data, and targeting inputs publishes the opinion that some cultures are dysfunctional and regressive, you should ask which cultures. And you should ask whose software will decide.
That is the pivotal danger of the librarian with the launch button.
Exactly.
If the software algorithm mathematically categorizes your demographic or your community as part of a dysfunctional culture, and that exact same software platform is generating the AI target lists for ICE deportations or military drone strikes, the loop of algorithmic authoritarianism is entirely closed.
It's inescapable.
The software becomes judge, jury, and executioner, operating under the guise of objective mathematics.
Let's look at points 5 and 12, which shift the focus to global warfare.
Okay.
Point 5 aggressively argues against the international regulation of AI autonomous weapons, essentially using the classic tech arms race justification. Someone is going to build them eventually, so it might as well be us.
The classic excuse.
Right. And point 12 makes a massive historical declaration, stating that the atomic age of nuclear deterrence is ending, and a new era of deterrence built entirely on artificial intelligence is beginning.
The investigation translates this corporate speak very clearly. Palantir is demanding that the international community avoid signing any treaties that would regulate autonomous killing machines.
Right.
They are acknowledging that nuclear weapons were successfully held in check by international law and statecraft, but they fully intend for AI weapons to be controlled solely by private, unaccountable corporations like themselves.
There's a brazen demand for a corporate monopoly on the new paradigm of global violence.
And then there is the profound hypocrisy exposed in points 17 and 18. Point 17 makes a strong push for Silicon Valley to take an active role in addressing violent street crime.
Which the text translates as a thinly veiled sales pitch for their Gotham software to be used for predictive policing.
Right. The text likens this to the Philip K. Dick story Minority Report.
Or exactly.
The idea of deploying algorithms to arrest people or flood neighborhoods with police before crime even happens, based purely on algorithmic probability and data mapping.
Exactly. Omniscience over the working class. But then, literally in the very next breath, Point 18 sharply complains about the ruthless exposure of the private lives of public figures.
The cognitive dissonance is truly deafening here. They are demanding absolute predictive omniscience over the public, tracking every digital movement of the average citizen to predict crime, but they demand impenetrable privacy for the elite billionaire class.
It's just so blatant.
And the investigation immediately and brutally ties this back to Jeffrey Epstein. When Palantir's manifesto complains about the private lives of wealthy figures being exposed by the press, the text reminds us of the $40 million, the wild Palo Alto dinners, the flight logs, and exactly whose private life Palantir's chairman wishes had remained hidden from public scrutiny.
It all circles back to the Capitol.
So what does this all mean? When a private, heavily militarized company holding your medical history, your IRS tax data, and your toll booth logs publishes a manifesto ranking human cultures as dysfunctional, you have to ask whose algorithm is deciding which category you fall into.
That's the question you have to ask.
And if the architects of that algorithm fundamentally believe that democracy is a failed, inefficient experiment, what happens to you when the software decides that you are on the wrong side of their new, hyper-efficient corporate republic?
Synthesizing the investigation's overarching thesis brings us to a very dark, very specific historical timeline.
Right.
The text points out that the time of its writing, April 2026, places us exactly 7 years away from the 100th anniversary of the 1933 Enabling Act in Germany.
Explain the mechanism of the Enabling Act, because it's crucial to understand how democracies actually die. They rarely die in a violent overnight coup.
Exactly. The Enabling Act was the specific parliamentary law passed in 1933 that allowed Adolf Hitler's cabinet to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag.
The democratic parliament?
Right. It granted him emergency dictatorial powers.
Right.
And the core justification used to pass that law was efficiency.
Interesting.
The argument was that the democratic machinery of the Weimar Republic was simply too slow, too messy, and too deadlocked to handle the economic and political crises of the day. They argued that the state needed a CEO-like figure to cut through the red tape.
And the investigation lays out the pieces currently on the board, showing how history is echoing.
Yes.
Peter Thiel has been publicly wishing for a shortcut around the checks and balances of the Constitution since 2004. Curtis Yarvin has been writing dense treatises advocating for a CEO king since 2007. Politicians entirely funded by this ecosystem are currently sitting at the absolute highest levels of the executive branch.
Right.
And Palantir has been methodically building the exact integrated information architecture to make a suspension of democracy logistically possible since 2003.
The investigation's chilling conclusion is that with the publication of this manifesto, they are no longer hiding their intentions.
Not at all.
The text argues that the manifesto is not a PR blunder or a slip of the tongue. It is a confession.
Wow.
And as the author powerfully states, confessions are not given in shame. Confessions are given by people who believe they will not be punished.
That is a heavy quote.
Palantir and its ideological architects believe they've already won the game. They have the venture capital, they have the military contracts, they have the universal adapter software deeply embedded in the state's nervous system, and now they are simply, arrogantly, telling the public exactly what they plan to do with it.
Which brings us to the investigation's final two-word plea to the reader. Stay awake.
Stay awake.
The text is begging the public to understand that the invisible software layer dictating the rules of modern society isn't just boring IT infrastructure. It isn't just a matter for network engineers.
Yeah.
It is the literal battleground for the future of human freedom. We have to care deeply about who writes the code, who funds the code, and what specific political ideology that code is mathematically designed to enforce.
It requires a fundamental, immediate shift in how we view civic duty. Understanding software APIs, government contracting procedures, and algorithmic data integration is no longer just a hobby for tech specialists.
Right.
It is an absolute requirement for basic democratic participation in the 21st century.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything this investigation laid out today.
Okay.
The architects of this Palantir system, men like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin, look at the slow, messy, constantly arguing nature of democracy, and they see a bug.
They do.
They see a massive, intolerable inefficiency that needs to be fixed by sleek, ruthless, algorithmic perfection. They want the trains to run on time directed by AI.
Right.
But what if they have it completely fundamentally backward? What if the very inefficiency of human bureaucracy, the slow, frustrating, gridlocked, endlessly messy reality of democratic pluralism, where nobody gets exactly what they want and everyone is forced to argue about it in public, what if that friction is actually a feature?
I love that.
What if that inefficiency is our greatest and perhaps our only defense against algorithmic authoritarianism?
It's a great question.
What if the friction of human debate is the only thing that stops the machine from executing a flawless, terrible perfection? Keep that in mind the next time you hear a billionaire suggest that the government would run so much better if it were just managed like a tech corporation. Until next time.